They say children are resilient, that they forget, that time moves on. But neglect does not shout. It does not bruise loudly. It disappears into silence. Growing up in neglect is not always about what was done to you. It is about what was never done at all. The comfort that never came. The questions never asked. The arms that never reached back. How do you miss something you were never given? How do you grieve an absence that had no name? Neglect teaches a child to need less, to speak less, to expect less, and sometimes to feel less. But that less does not vanish with adulthood. It lingers in relationships, in self-worth, in the quiet fear of being too much or not enough. Today, we explore the silent psychology of those who grew up unseen. Not to blame, not to accuse, but to understand the shape of an absence. Let's begin. There are children who cry loudly, and there are children who stop crying. Neglect rarely creates rebellion at first, creates quiet. The invisible child learns something subtle and dangerous. That attention is not guaranteed. That comfort is unpredictable. That emotional presence is optional. Maybe no one meant harm. Maybe the adults were tired, distracted, overwhelmed. But to a child, inconsistency feels like disappearance. You learn to read the room before you learn to read books, to measure tone, to sense mood shifts, to decide quickly whether your feelings were safe to express. And when they weren't, you folded them inward. A child does not think, "My caregiver is emotionally unavailable." A child thinks, "I must be asking for too much," so the requests grow smaller, the excitement softer, the sadness swallowed. Neglect is not always a slammed door. Sometimes it is a door that never fully opens. You may have sat at the dinner table, physically present, yet emotionally alone. Your stories half told. Your fears brushed aside with "you're fine." Your achievements met with mild acknowledgement, but not curiosity. And slowly, invisibility becomes identity. You become the easy child, the independent one, the one who doesn't cause trouble. Adults often praise this adaptation. They call it maturity, strength, self-sufficiency. But beneath that early independence is something else. A nervous system that learned not to rely. When a child consistently experiences emotional absence, something shifts internally. The brain begins conserving energy. Why reach outward if no one consistently reaches back? Why risk disappointment? So you learned to self-soothe before you truly knew how. You comforted yourself with imagination, with silence, with distraction, and perhaps over time you stopped expecting anyone to notice when you were hurting. The invisible child does not disappear physically. They disappear emotionally. And the most painful part? No one realizes it's happening, because there is no crisis, no broken plates, no raised voices, just a slow fading. You may not remember a single dramatic moment. Instead, you remember a pattern, a feeling of being peripheral, of watching connection happen around you but not fully to you. And so you adapted. You became less demanding, less expressive, less visible. But children are not meant to raise themselves emotionally. They are meant to be mirrored, reflected, responded to. When that mirroring is absent, a quiet question begins forming. If no one sees me, do I exist the way I think I do? That question does not vanish with age. It simply changes shape. It becomes difficulty asking for reassurance. It becomes discomfort when someone focuses on you. It becomes the habit of shrinking in rooms where you deserve space. The invisible child survives by disappearing. And survival, though powerful, leaves traces. A child's needs are not excessive. They are instinctive. The need to be held when afraid. The need to be listened to without interruption. The need to feel important to someone. But when those needs are repeatedly met with distraction, impatience, or emotional distance, something subtle begins to happen. You start editing yourself. Maybe you were told, "Not now." Maybe the adult in the room was physically present but mentally somewhere else. Maybe your tears were met with logic instead of comfort. Over time, you learned that your emotions disrupted something, that your sadness was inconvenient, that your excitement was too loud, that your questions came at the wrong time. So you adjusted, you waited, you hesitated, you rehearsed sentences in your mind before speaking them aloud. And eventually, you stopped asking altogether. This is how neglect reshapes expression, not through punishment, but through subtle discouragement. When a child repeatedly feels that their needs create tension, they internalize a quiet conclusion. My needs are a burden. This belief does not form in words. It forms in the body. You may notice it now as hesitation before asking for help, as guilt when someone does something kind for you, as anxiety when attention lingers too long, because attention once felt unstable. Children are wired to seek connection. It is not weakness, it is biology. The brain releases soothing chemicals when a caregiver responds warmly. The nervous system calms. The world feels predictable. But when responses are inconsistent or absent, the nervous system adapts differently. It becomes cautious, self-reliant, guarded. You may have learned to soothe yourself quickly, to tell yourself, it's not a big deal, to minimize your own pain before anyone else could. And this self-minimization becomes automatic. As an adult, you might struggle to identify what you actually need, not because you don't have needs, but because you trained yourself not to feel them clearly. Neglect teaches endurance, teaches you to survive without reassurance, to process emotions alone, to downplay disappointment. But endurance is not the same as fulfillment. Somewhere inside, there is still a younger version of you who once reached outward before learning that reaching might not change anything. And perhaps the hardest part is this: you were not too much. You were simply too alone. When needs are treated as inconveniences, a child does not become need-free. They become need-silent. And silence, though quiet, echoes. Loneliness is not always the absence of people. Sometimes it is the absence of emotional response. A child can grow up in a full house and still feel alone. Neglect does something quiet but profound to the nervous system. Teaches it to expect little. When emotional connection is inconsistent, the brain does not stop wanting it. It simply becomes uncertain about it. And uncertainty keeps the body alert. Children rely on caregivers not just for food or shelter, but for emotional regulation. A soothing voice slows the heartbeat. A gentle touch lowers cortisol. A reassuring presence tells the body, you are safe. But when that reassurance is missing, the nervous system learns to regulate alone. At first, this may look like resilience. A child who rarely cries, who handles things quietly, who doesn't need much. But internally, something else may be happening. Without reliable comfort, the stress response can become overactive. The body stays slightly tense. The mind scans for emotional availability. The child becomes hyper-aware of subtle cues. Tone shifts, facial expressions, silence. Because silence once meant disconnection. Over time, two common patterns begin to form. Some children grow into hyper-independent adults. They rely only on themselves. They struggle to trust others with vulnerability. They feel safest when they need no one. Others grow into anxious seekers of closeness. They crave reassurance. They fear abandonment intensely. They feel unsettled when connection feels distant. Both patterns are rooted in the same early lesson. Connection is uncertain. This is the nervous system trying to protect you. If love was unpredictable, your body learned to prepare for its absence. If comfort was inconsistent, your body learned not to depend on it fully. And so even in adulthood, when someone offers stable affection, your system may hesitate. You may question it, test it, brace for it to disappear, because your body remembers what your mind may not clearly recall. Neglect is often invisible in memory. There are no dramatic scenes to replay, just a persistent background feeling. A low hum of aloneness. You might struggle to relax fully in relationships, to believe someone will stay emotionally present. to trust that your needs will not exhaust them. Not because you are broken, but because your nervous system was trained in uncertainty. And uncertainty leaves a residue. The child who learned to self-regulate too early becomes the adult who struggles to lean, who feels safest when independent, who equates vulnerability with risk. Loneliness in this context is not weakness. It is adaptation, a body that learned to survive without steady comfort. And survival, though remarkable, is not the same as feeling secure. There is a particular strength that grows in neglected children. It looks admirable from the outside. They do not complain. They do not demand. They handle things. But strength can sometimes be camouflage. When your emotions were not consistently received, you learned to manage them privately. You rehearsed composure. You practiced neutrality. You became fluent in the language of "I'm fine." Not because you were fine, but because explaining felt pointless. Over time, this composure becomes identity. You become the reliable one, the calm one, the emotionally low-maintenance one. People admire your independence. They lean on you. They trust your steadiness. And yet, somewhere beneath that steadiness, there may be an unspoken exhaustion. Because holding yourself together without being held by someone else is tiring. Neglect teaches containment. You learn to tuck feelings away quickly, to minimize disappointment before it spread, to swallow hurt before it became visible. The problem is not that you have no emotions. It is that you became efficient at hiding them, even from yourself. As an adult, this can look like difficulty naming what you feel, a vague sense of heaviness without clear cause, an automatic smile when someone asks how you are. "I'm fine" becomes reflex. But what does fine actually mean? Does it mean safe, satisfied, connected, or does it mean undisturbed enough to function? Neglected children often grow into adults who are deeply self-reliant. They anticipate their own needs. They solve their own problems. They avoid burdening others. But self-reliance can quietly block intimacy. If no one sees your struggles, no one has the chance to respond to them. And if no one responds, the old belief is reinforced. My inner world does not require attention. You may even feel uncomfortable when someone tries to look closer, when they ask a second question, when they notice something beneath your composure. Being seen can feel unfamiliar, and unfamiliar can feel unsafe. So the mask remains. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just subtle emotional distance. The tragedy of the "I'm fine" mask is that it works. Prevents rejection. It avoids disappointment. Protects you from unmet expectations. But it also prevents comfort. Because comfort requires exposure. And exposure once led to silence. The child who learned not to expect emotional response becomes the adult who stops offering emotional signals. Not because they feel nothing, but because feeling out loud once felt unnecessary, or worse, inconvenient, and so the mask stays in place. Smooth, functional, capable. Yet underneath it, there is still a younger self who once hoped someone would ask twice. Love is meant to feel warm, steady, safe. But when you grew up in neglect, love can feel unfamiliar, even destabilizing. Not because you do not want it, but because your body does not fully recognize it. When someone shows consistent care, something inside you may tighten instead of soften. You might question their intentions, wonder how long it will last, wait for the shift, because attention in your early life was unpredictable. Healthy love can feel too bright, too exposing, too close. If you learn to survive without steady emotional presence, intimacy can feel like standing in direct sunlight after years in shade. It is not painful because it is wrong. It is painful because it is new. You may find yourself pulling away when someone gets too near, downplaying your feelings when they express theirs, creating distance after moments of closeness. Not consciously, but protectively. Neglect often creates a quiet equation. Vulnerability equals risk. If expressing needs once led to silence, then expressing them again can feel dangerous. So even when someone offers reliability, your system hesitates. You might test them, withdraw to see if they follow, brace for disappointment before it arrives, because preparing for loss once felt safer than hoping for stability. And yet, at the same time, you may crave closeness deeply. You may long for someone to notice the parts you rarely show, to sit with you without distraction, to respond, not dismiss. This is the inner conflict of neglect, a desire for connection paired with fear of it. Love feels foreign not because you are incapable of it, but because it was never modeled in a consistent way. You may struggle to believe compliments, feel suspicious of kindness, wonder why someone would choose you, not out of arrogance, but out of unfamiliarity. If you were not consistently mirrored as worthy, your self-image may still carry that uncertainty. So when someone sees you clearly, it can feel disorienting. Part of you wants to lean in, part of you wants to retreat. This push and pull is not drama. It is adaptation. The child who learned not to rely now stands in front of steady care, unsure how to receive it. And perhaps the quietest fear beneath it all is this: if I let myself need this, and it disappears, will I survive it again? So love remains at arm's length, desired, but cautiously approached, because what is unfamiliar can feel more threatening than what is lonely. Neglect does not usually say, "You are worthless," says nothing, and in that silence, a child begins to fill in the blanks. If your emotions were rarely acknowledged, you may have concluded they were insignificant. If your presence did not shift the room, you may have assumed you did not matter within it. Children personalize absence. They do not think, "My caregiver lacks emotional capacity." They think, "Something about me is not worth responding to." This is how unworthiness takes root. Quietly, gradually, without a single defining moment. You may not carry dramatic memories, just a faint, persistent feeling of being secondary, replaceable, peripheral. And as you grew older, that feeling may have translated into subtle patterns. Over-apologizing, over-performing, over-giving, or the opposite, withdrawing before anyone can confirm your fears. Neglect often leaves behind a belief that attention must be earned, that love must be justified, that visibility requires proof of usefulness. So you become helpful, accommodating, impressive, low maintenance, because if you are exceptional, maybe you will be seen. If you are easy, maybe you will not be abandoned. But beneath those strategies lies a deeper question. Am I inherently worthy, or only valuable when I provide something? This question can echo into adulthood. You may struggle to accept care without reciprocating immediately, feel guilty for taking up space, downplay your achievements to avoid seeming self-centered. Unworthiness does not always scream. It whispers, tells you not to ask for too much, not to expect too much, not to assume you will be chosen. And so you move through life carefully, grateful for scraps of validation, uncertain of your place in rooms you belong in. The tragedy of neglect is not just the absence of attention. It is the story the child creates to survive that absence. A story that says, "If I were more interesting, more lovable, more important, they would have noticed." But emotional absence is not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence of limitation on the part of those who could not provide what you needed. Still, the echo lingers. Even when someone affirms you, even when you succeed, even when you are loved, a quiet voice may ask, "Is this real or temporary?" That voice is not weakness. It is history. The invisible child grew up, but the questions they formed in silence still seek reassurance. There comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you begin to notice the pattern. Not with blame, not with accusation, but with recognition. You start to see how often you say it's okay when it isn't. How quickly you change the subject when attention turns toward you. How instinctively you minimize your own hurt. Awareness can feel unsettling at first, because if neglect shaped you, then parts of your personality were not simply preferences. They were protections. The independence, the composure, the low expectations. They were strategies. And strategies are hard to release when they once kept you safe. Learning to be seen does not begin with dramatic vulnerability. It begins with small acknowledgments, admitting to yourself that something mattered, that something hurt, that something was missing. For someone who grew up in neglect, even identifying a need can feel radical. You may pause mid-conversation and realize you are about to say, "I'm fine" again. You may feel a subtle discomfort when someone asks, "What do you want?" Because being asked what you want assumes that your answer matters. And that can feel unfamiliar. Relearning visibility is not about becoming louder. It is about becoming honest. It is about allowing your internal experience to exist without immediate dismissal. This process is slow. Your nervous system may still tense when you open up. You may still anticipate indifference. You may still feel exposed when someone listens carefully. But something shifts when you stay present in those moments. When you allow someone to respond. When you notice that the world does not collapse because you expressed a need. Safety for you may not feel natural. It may feel learned, like a new language your body is practicing. There is courage in this. Not dramatic courage, not performative healing, but the quiet courage of letting yourself take up a little more space than before, of asking one more question, of sharing one more truth. The invisible child survived by shrinking. The adult you are becoming survives by unfolding. And unfolding does not erase the past. It simply creates room for something different. Being seen is not about demanding attention. It is about allowing your existence to register to yourself first, and perhaps slowly to others. Neglect leaves no visible scar. No story dramatic enough to retell at gatherings. No single event to point to and say, "That was the moment." It leaves something quieter. An emptiness shaped like unanswered questions. A sensitivity to absence. A reflex to disappear before anyone asks you to. And yet, there is something else it leaves behind. Endurance. Perception. A deep awareness of emotional nuance. You learn to read between lines. To sense shifts in atmosphere. To survive without constant reassurance. There is strength in that. But strength does not mean the wound was small. The quiet return to self begins when you stop measuring your pain against louder stories. When you stop telling yourself it wasn't that bad. When you allow the absence to count. Because what was missing mattered. You mattered. Not because you were exceptional. Not because you were convenient. Not because you earned it. But because children are meant to be responded to. The invisible child did not imagine the loneliness. They adapted to it. And now, as an adult, you may still feel traces of that adaptation, in your caution, in your restraint, in your hesitation to take up space. But you are not fading anymore. You are noticing. You are naming. You are allowing. And that is not weakness. It is reclamation. Reclaiming the parts of you that learned to stay quiet. Reclaiming the emotions that were tucked away. Reclaiming the belief that your presence has weight. Neglect taught you to survive without being fully seen. Life now offers something different. Not perfection, not constant attention, but the possibility of mutual presence. And perhaps the most healing realization is this. The absence you experienced says nothing about your worth. It speaks only of what others could not give. You were never too much. You were never not enough. You were simply unseen. If parts of this reflection felt familiar, if something quiet inside you was touched, then you are not alone in this experience. There are many who learned to shrink in order to survive. Many who became strong before they were held. Many who are still learning that their inner world deserves space. If you'd like to stay connected, this space exists to explore the hidden corners of the human heart. Gently, honestly, without judgment. And if you feel comfortable, you're welcome to share your thoughts below. Not because you owe a story, but because your words might help someone else realize they are not invisible either. Take care of yourself.